Coming up on Network Africa, turbulence injures passengers on flight to Mauritius. U.S. Special Forces hold drills with West African armies. Plus, Black Wall Street survivors granted Ghana citizenship. Hello and welcome to the program today. Thank you for joining us. I'm Anne Mwawadu. We start in Mauritius, where at least 17 passengers have been injured, 2 of them seriously, after a Condor Airlines flight from Frankfurt, Germany was hit by severe turbulence. The plane was caught in the severe turbulence while flying near Madagascar 2 hours before its scheduled landing in Mauritius. It managed to make an emergency landing at Mauritius International Airport at about 6:40 local time. An emergency team evacuated the injured passengers to the nearest hospital. There were 270 passengers on board flight DE2314 during this incident. The United States has begun its annual counter-terrorism training program for African forces in Ghana, aimed at strengthening border defenses in the fight against Islamist insurgents who are spreading south into new territories. The program, known as Flintlock, started at a military base in the dusty northern town of Daboya, where U.S. and European trainers drilled soldiers from across Africa on first aid and fire drills in the baking heat. The training comes as a critical time for West Africa, where groups linked to Islamic State and Al-Qaeda continue to carry out routine attacks on civilians and the military, despite costly interventions from international forces. What began as a Mali-based insurgency in 2012 has since ballooned into a regional network of competing Islamist groups that operate across large areas of landlocked Niger and Burkina Faso, which in recent years have spread into coastal countries including Benin, Togo, and Ivory Coast. So far, Ghana, whose rural north borders Burkina Faso, has been spared the violence. 2 survivors of the 1921 massacre of black people in the U.S. city of Tulsa have been granted citizenship of Ghana. Viola Ford Fletcher, 108, and her brother Hughes Van Ellis, 102, became the oldest African Americans to be granted Ghanaian citizenship. They are 2 of 3 living survivors of the massacre that claimed up to 300 African American lives. About 300 black residents of the prosperous Greenwood town, then known as Black Wall Street in Oklahoma, were murdered, and their businesses and homes were destroyed by a mob of white people. Viola Fletcher, known as Mother Fletcher, and her brother Van Ellis, known as Uncle Red, visited Ghana in August 2021 as part of a week-long tour of Africa to mark the century of the killings, dubbed the Tulsa Race Massacre. And we have our correspondent now, Maria Bird from Washington. She's joining us via Skype. Hello, Maria.
Hello, how are you?
Very well. Okay, so can you tell us a bit about this massacre? Give us a sense of what it was like.
This massacre was something that I think took the African American community by storm during those times. As we know, it was in the midst and the beginning of what would be considered the Jim Crow era. This was post the Civil War, post what was considered the Renaissance era in the U.S. And this was when African Americans were beginning to pull their resources together to ensure and to bring Black businesses and to ensure that the finance and the economics of the African American community was strengthened. Obviously, this became clearly a trouble time for America as we were dealing with lots of racial inequalities at that time. And so white vigilantes actually went and burned down what was considered Black Wall Street. As you stated before, 300 were killed in this massacre, and these last 3 surviving citizens of that community obviously today have been touted as one of the beginning of what was considered the elite time of Black economics. And so I think that, as you mentioned, this award of their being able to have dual citizenship, it just shows kind of where many Americans are, and they were very happy to be able to receive this type of honor from Ghana.
Given that these 2 survivors' Ghanaian citizenship looks like a compensation, if you ask some people, but should they be happy about it? What should they make of this citizenship being given?
Well, as many people know, 2019 was the 400-year anniversary of the first slave that hit the U.S. shores. And there has been, as we know, there have been several movements and movements in the U.S. to try to have many African Americans go back to the continent, whether or not it's Liberia that we know. And as we also know, there have been many African Americans very interested in understanding their African heritage and their African history. And so I think this was all a part of being able to truly understand. I'm not sure if it was so much of a reparations, but more so of being able to be connected with the continent that all African Americans are descendants of.
All right. Has any other compensation been considered for them apart from this citizenship?
Well, as you mentioned, the Greenwood Foundation has been working many years now on being able to secure additional compensation for the families that were obviously devastated as a result of the massacre. And so this, I'm not sure if it's a compensation, more so an honor. And I think it's a signal to the rest of the African American community that African countries are welcoming to African Americans. And I think at their age of over 100, showing that they have that level of interest. And as we know, as you said, 2021, they actually visited Ghana.
And I'm just wondering how they will be feeling after all these years. Do you have an idea?
Well, after all these years, I think more than anything, they have been advocates for the economic progress of African Americans as a result of the massacre. And I think what we're going to see is they're going to continue as long as they're here to be those advocates and to obviously support Black business in the U.S.
All right, our Washington correspondent Maria Bird giving us some perspective on the Tulsa Massacre. Thank you very much for your time on Network Africa. Now to other stories. The U.S. has placed a bounty on the spokesperson of the militant Islamist Al-Shabaab group. It offered $5 million for information leading to the identification or the location of Ali Mohammed Rage, who is known as Ali Dihire. He has been an Al-Shabaab's chief spokesperson since May 2009, and he's a senior leader of the group, and that's according to the State Department. Al-Shabaab militants have recently carried out several attacks in Somalia, despite government forces gaining ground in areas previously under the group's control. Chair of the Security Council Committee, pursuant to Resolution 751/1992 concerning Al-Shabaab, Eshikane Kimiro, has indicated the panel's readiness to continue pursuing investigation into Al-Shabaab finances. Eshikane Kimiro also updated council members on the progress that has been made so far on issues related to the smuggling of weapons between Somalia and Yemen.
Report. Since the last briefing to the Council, the committee has met twice in informal consultations. On November the 29th, 2022, the committee met jointly with the Security Council Committee established pursuant to Resolution 2140. The 2 committees heard briefings by the panel of experts on Somalia and the panel of experts on Yemen, respectively, on issues related to the smuggling of weapons between Somalia and Yemen. The panel's coordinator updated committee members on recent developments in Somalia relevant to the panel's mandate. He informed the members that in line with its mandate, the panel would continue to pursue investigations into Al-Shabaab finances, including seaport operations in Somalia that may generate revenue for Al-Shabaab, as well as potential violation of the arms embargo and the charcoal ban. I will report on the statistics with regard to the arms embargo and the improvised explosive device exemptions notifications in my next briefing to the Council.
The President of France, Emmanuel Macron, began a tour of Central Africa yesterday in an attempt to safeguard French interests in Africa as anti-French sentiment runs high in a majority of African nations. He landed in Gabon's capital, Libreville, and will later head to Angola, Congo, Brazzaville, and the neighboring Democratic Republic of Congo. Mr. Macron's trip comes as alarm grows in Paris over Russia's rising influence in French-speaking African countries, joining China, which has been present in the region for some years. In a speech on France's Africa policy, Mr. Macron called for a mutual and responsible relationship with a continent of more than 50 countries, including climate issues. He also said the French military will reduce its footprint on the continent in the coming months, though a military source and analysts have said that French army chiefs may be reluctant to do so. Today, he attends the One Forest Summit on preserving forests worldwide, including along the vast Congo River basin. After Gabon, he will head to the former Portuguese colony of Angola on Friday. There, he is set to sign an accord to develop the agricultural sector, and this is part of a drive to enhance French ties with English and Portuguese-speaking parts of Africa. Finally, he will end his trip on Saturday in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Let's head over to Mali now, where suspected Islamist militants have killed at least 12 people in the central Mopti region. Officials say gunmen burst into the village in the area, shooting at people, burning homes, and then they chased those trying to flee into nearby forests. One official said as many as 19 bodies have been found and the search for more victims is still going on. Meanwhile, the United Nations has announced the name of 3 peacekeepers that were killed in Mali days before. Speaking to journalists in New York, Stéphane Dujarric, the spokesperson for the Secretary General, said the peacekeepers were part of a Senegalese contingent to the UN mission in the country.
The UN peacekeeping mission in Mali reports that 3 peacekeepers from Senegal were killed and 5 others were injured this morning when their convoy hit an improvised explosive device in the Bandiagara region in central Mali. The Secretary General conveys his deepest condolences to the families of the peacekeepers, and we of course wish the wounded peacekeepers a speedy and full recovery. The head of the peacekeeping mission in Mali, El Gassi Mouane, said this was yet another tragic illustration of the complexity of the operational environment and sacrifices made for restoring peace in the country.
Welcome back. The government of the Democratic Republic of Congo, the United Nations, and the humanitarian community have launched an appeal in Kinshasa for $2.25 billion to provide life-saving assistance to about 10 million people this year. The UN spokesperson, who was giving the news to reporters, said that 1 in 4 Congolese cannot meet their basic food needs. He calls on the international community to be very generous with this appeal and all the UN other humanitarian appeals.
Republic of the Congo, the government and the UN and the humanitarian community today launched an appeal in Kinshasa for $2.25 billion to provide life-saving assistance to some 10 million people this year. 1 in 4 Congolese, which is 26.4 million men, women, and children, cannot meet their basic food needs. Some 6.4 million people are impacted by acute malnutrition, a figure that has not decreased in the last 2 decades. The DRC is the country most impacted by food insecurity in the world. It is also a country with the largest number of internally displaced people on the African continent. Years of violence and insecurity have driven 5.7 million people from their homes. In recent months, there have been a worrying spike in violence in the eastern provinces of Ituri and North Kivu, as we've been telling you. Last year's humanitarian response plan, which called for $1.9 billion, was only 48% funded. We call on the international community to be very generous with this appeal and all our humanitarian appeals.
Resident of Hood Bay community close to South Africa's tourist capital, Cape Town, held a candlelight vigil last night as the search continued for a 22-year-old German who went missing during a hike last month. 5 South African suspects aged between 20 and 25 years were arrested after being found in possession of items that belonged to the missing Nick Frischke. They appeared in court facing charges of robbery with aggravating circumstances. Police say among the items found was a credit card, adding that investigators believe it was taken during a robbery. The case has now been postponed until March the 6th for further investigation. President Cyril Ramaphosa is hosting his Ugandan counterpart, President Yoweri Kaguta Museveni, for a state visit to Pretoria, the South African capital. President Museveni's visit is directed at consolidating bilateral relations between both countries, with discussions between the two heads of state encompassing political, economic, regional, continental, and international issues. President Museveni is accompanied by several cabinet ministers and a business delegation participating in the Business Forum, which began on Monday, the 27th. The Republic of Uganda is South Africa's 15th largest trading partner on the continent and the 2nd largest in East Africa.
Africa is proud of its very deep and fraternal relations with Uganda, relations that date back to the struggle against colonialism and apartheid. At great risk and sacrifice, Uganda stood firm in its support to the liberation struggle and contributed materially and in many other ways to help us achieve our freedom and our democracy. On behalf of the people of South Africa, allow me to express our appreciation to the people of Uganda for their contribution to our freedom. Relations between our two countries are based on the principles of mutual respect, the promotion of Pan-Africanism, and a commitment to human rights and also to the emancipation of women.
Your Excellency President Ramaphosa and the leaders of South Africa who are here, on behalf of the Ugandans, I'm very happy to be here. In 1967, I recruited myself into the ANC in Dar es Salaam. I just walked to Swai Priso's office, and I became a member of ANC. You can see now, 55 years later, at that time, really, nobody could believe that we would be here in Pretoria, because the situation in the world was very complicated. So I congratulate the people of South Africa for the big struggle they waged.
Some U.S. lawmakers have expressed displeasure with South Africa's decision to host the just concluded joint military exercises with Russia and China on the very first anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but said it will not affect already established health partnerships between both countries. South Africa's 10-day joint naval exercises with China and Russia have been concluded. They have fueled domestic criticisms and fears that the drills will endanger important relations with Western partners. But Republican U.S. Senator Lindsey Graham, at a press briefing in Johannesburg, said that ending his country's 20-year-old U.S. president's emergency plan for AIDS relief program aimed at HIV treatment and prevention could also hurt the United States. Senator Graham is part of a delegation of senators who visited South Africa with musical legend and activist Elton John, whose AIDS Foundation has raised more than $600 million for the PEPFAR program.
Friends in South Africa, it's a small group today, but you do joint naval exercises with Russia and China on the anniversary of the invasion of Ukraine by Putin, you're going to have problems. No matter what they do tomorrow with the Russians, I think it would be stupid for us in the United States to terminate this program because it would bite us in the ass eventually. If this thing flames up in Africa, it's going to come to America. So when you have a problem with a country, the first thing you need to do is make sure you don't hurt yourself.
The virus hiding now in three populations: children, adolescent girls, and young women, and key populations in Africa. Just to put numbers to it, 60% of new infections occur now in adolescent girls and young women in Africa. That's what Sir Etienne was saying. We have to mobilize, we have to create a movement of young people.
This disease is in the hands of the young now in Africa. The young, it's a very young continent, and Africa now needs to enable these young people to take it and run with it, and especially the men, because the girls take it 90%, but the men are just a little, they're still stigmatized by this whole thing.
Charcoal is the second main source of cooking fuel in Benin, and demand is already rising. According to the World Bank data, the country turned over 3.3 million tons of wood into charcoal in 2017 versus the 2.5 million tons Benin Republic turned out in 2010.
Dismayed at the number of trucks carrying piles of charcoal out of Benin's forested back country, Roland Ajovi was inspired to look for a more sustainable alternative in 2017. Maize husks, cassava peelings, coconut shells and other organic waste have become raw materials for the 36-year-old entrepreneur's charcoal business.
I said, how come we're asked to fight against deforestation, yet we have so many bags of wooden charcoal being transported to our cities? So that's what motivated me to start my own research. It is 3 times more ecological than normal charcoal, because it has a very, very high calorific value and allows the food to be cooked very quickly.
According to a UN Food Agency report, over 60% of the world's charcoal is produced in Africa, where it is sourced mainly from forests and woodlands, driving forest degradation. Only a small volume is produced sustainably. Ajovi is among those trying to change this. He and his employees collect, sort, and dry the organic waste before burning it into a carbonized powder that is processed into briquettes and sold by the kilogram or in larger sacks.
Here, the process does not contribute to deforestation. We don't need to cut trees in the forest. We don't need to destroy all the vegetation to reap the rewards. It is the agricultural debris that have already become useless that allow you to make this coal. Also, this coal does not give off much in terms of pollution.
The UN Environment Programme, which also highlighted similar projects in Ethiopia, Cameroon, Kenya and Tanzania, says this kind of innovative charcoal production is urgently required to prevent further forest degradation and loss of biodiversity. For now, EcoSeeker sells at a small profit to wholesalers, but Ajovi believes as people learn of the properties of his charcoal, sales will increase.
And that's Network Africa for today. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Anne Nwawadu.